Adam Whitty. Welcome to the season finale of Build Your Authority.
Joe Bardavia.
It's been quite a ride, Adam, and I'm going to miss that until next season. But it's been amazing to have these conversations talking about building your authority, and we've done it via the podcast platform and also on YouTube. But I want to start with your connection with podcasting, because I joined the company in 2020. Boy, so it feels like a long time ago, Adam. Different world. We were back there. But I want to talk about podcasting and authority, and in terms of how you realized that this was going to be an important vertical, another sort of quiver in your bucket of arrows when it comes to building your authority. Why podcasting, Adam?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, most of our clients that we support, we call them members. They're CEOs, they're entrepreneurs, they're business leaders, and they are creating thought leadership around their business expertise. And initially, a lot of that will start in what I call written word media, right? And written word media would be writing and publishing a book. It might be writing and publishing articles or blog posts, but a lot of it is written word media, content that you would consume through reading. And the truth is that most business people are trying to reach, usually, other business people who are extremely time-starved and don't have a lot of time to read. But those same very people do oftentimes have the time to listen, right? And that's because they're traveling. They're on a plane, they're on a train, they're in their automobile, they're commuting, and they have time to listen, but perhaps not read. And so for that reason alone, I have always believed that audiobooks, and, over the last probably 7 or 8 years, as podcasts have really become a huge form of media, have become increasingly important, period, but increasingly important to our audience who's trying to reach really busy people that don't have the time to consume content through reading, but they do have the time to consume it through listening.
And I'm going to connect those two because, as you know, Adam, one of the running lines I like to use when I meet folks when it comes to podcasting is your book is your Bible, your podcast is your Sunday sermon. It's really your ability to continue the conversation past the book's publication, because unless you're one of these authors that's going to have 3 or 4 reprints of the book is finite. It is what it is. But for you to relay the messages from that book over an extended period of time, well past publication, that to me is one of the biggest importance of connecting a book to a podcast.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And I will say that the goal of authority is, of course, to build your thought leadership, to build your expertise, but it's really to have influence with an audience. And the more influence you have with that audience, the more doors that will open for you, the more doors that will open for your business. And the best way to build loyalty, to build trust, to build relationship with an audience is through communication. Now, communication doesn't have to be 2 ways. It could be 1 way, right? I mean, there are people in our country that feel like they had a relationship. Maybe it was with, Ronald Reagan, listening to his stirring speeches, or maybe it was FDR listening to the fireside chats on the radio. They probably never met those presidents, but they felt like they had a relationship with them because they were listening to them. And the beautiful thing about a podcast is that it gives thought leaders the ability to build a relationship with their audience by coming into their homes, in this case, coming into their homes through perhaps Spotify or Apple iTunes or whatever platform your podcast is hosted on. But it gives you the ability to get into their homes and build a relationship by them listening to you communicating your thoughts and your ideas and, the various guests that you might have on your show. It's a really powerful thing.
Yeah, and also, me coming from the world of radio is the intimacy of it. Of all the electronic mediums, it is probably the most intimate. You are going to listen when you're trapped in your car, when you're walking your dog. In these moments where you're in your solitude, is that you're able to connect with people. And with a podcast, you're able to offer more. And one of the things I always often say to our members, Adam, is that we use the word interviews when it comes to podcasts for shorthand. But we never want any of our members who want to build their authority to interview a guest. We want them to have conversations with guests because there's no way for you to impart your wisdom, your thought leadership, if all you're doing is asking questions. I often joke, there's probably a bot out there that will do that one day where that's going to ask the questions for you. You have to worry about it. But the idea of podcasting, the intimacy, this connection of people, having these conversations where I say all the time, when's the last time you had a 1 hour uninterrupted conversation with another human being where you had no distractions, whether it's telephone, another human being, your cell phone going off? The intimacy and connecting and having these conversations are huge when it comes to building authority, Adam.
Yeah, and of course, the beauty of the podcast too is that you've got tone, you've got inflection. In this case, we have a video recording in the podcast, so we have our video podcast as well as audio, and so really now you have a more thorough ability to communicate because you've got voice inflection, you've got tone, and then you've got the different mannerisms that we can share as we're speaking with video cameras on. So it really does allow you to build a much deeper connection and relationship with your end viewer or your end listener.
And we spoke to David Meerman Scott, and the 3-word phrase has come up often on this podcast, but authority by association. The idea of being able to build your authority by speaking to people that have more authority than you might have in a particular industry. Tell me about that, more about the importance of building authority through association.
Well, the podcast method and medium is one of the best ways to build authority by association, specifically with the guests that you invite on to your podcast. Now, to your point, Joe, and I think it's really valuable and it should not be understated, is that when you have guests of authority on your podcast, you can't just be a journalist. You are an expert, they are an expert, and you two are having a conversation. But when you're standing next to someone of extreme authority, and in this case, you and I are kind of standing next to each other, I guess we're sitting next to each other, that person's authority rubs off on you, right? It creates a halo effect. And so this, more than anything else, the podcast medium more than anything else, is a great way to create that authority by association. Standing next to people of stature and extreme authority and letting it rub off on you.
It's sort of like that holiday party thing. Whenever you go to a party and you see someone like, hey, who's that person Adam's talking to? That person must be important if they're talking to Adam. It's so funny how, as humans, as evolved as we are, as smart as we are, we still want to be around the cool kids. Like, high school never ends, Adam, when it comes to being connected with people that have either better looking, whether they're smarter, funnier, more, they're richer. Who cares what it is? But we're always attracted to that person that just offers just a little bit more than the average Joe.
Now, speaking of the average Joe, which you're nothing, you're nothing of the sort. But let's talk for a minute about the principles of a great podcast, right? So if I want to put on a podcast, the first question that I might say is, okay, well, how long should it be? And, if I'm going to publish an episode, what day of the week should it be? And do I do this forever? Or are there seasons and then I get to take a break and then I do another season? So let's just talk for a minute about some of the logistics, kind of brass tacks of what makes a good podcast.
Being strategic is super important, Adam. And the last point you mentioned about, like, do I do this forever? There's this phrase in the podcast industry called the pod fade. And essentially a pod fade is you listen to a podcast and all of a sudden, without notice or announcement, that podcast just goes away. So to control that or preventing a pod fade, what you do is you strategize in terms of, you mentioned the word seasons. I think that's super important for people because expectations of yourself and your audience are the first things you need to answer. What time is expected of me? How much do I have to put into this? And what will my audience expect from me? So thinking of, and say a lot of our folks, Adam, as you know, CEOs, leaders, they're very busy. So encapsulating it in seasons, say, hey, listen, my 2025 looks crazy, but I think I might be able to do 10 podcasts. Great. Season 1's going to be 10 episodes. And then you have time in between to reload, refresh, and then think about a season 2. Thinking about it in seasons gives you sort of a goal and a safety net because, again, like you said, Adam, you don't know if you want to be doing this forever. So if you give yourself milestones to record a certain number of episodes by a time, that gives you the structure you need because a lot of our leaders need structure. We provide that, obviously, with our podcast platform. When it comes to drops, again, it goes back to the expectation, Adam, of if you decide to drop a monthly podcast the first Monday of every month, you better drop a podcast on the first Monday of every month. It's very important to remember that these expectations that you have upon yourself are just as important to your listener. You have to do whatever it takes to put on that podcast. And Adam, I always have this joke that, podcast is a show and the show must go on. So a lot of times I'll have a member say, hey man, I got a runny nose today. I don't know if I should do the podcast. I'm like, well, the person that you were supposed to record this podcast with you've been on their calendar for 3 months. And so as long as you don't have a flu or you're being hospitalized, you better be able to do that podcast. So having this mentality, the showman's mentality of the show must go on is super important when it comes to these podcasts. It can't be a hobby. I always say a podcast should be a hobby that you treat like a profession. And that's why people that have maybe turned it into a profession had that mindset of, hey, I'm doing this because I love it, but because I'm putting so much work into it, I'm so locked into what has to be done to deliver this podcast to an audience, then it becomes a profession. And that is a super incredible mindset to attain for most people because they don't think that way.
Hey, Joe, do you have a rule of how long a podcast should be? And does it depend on the topic or who your audience is?
Yeah, and when it comes to length, and this goes back to guests as well. So usually, typically, when someone is booked on a podcast, they're booked for an hour. Unless it's a Joe Rogan podcast, which is like a 3-day podcast. You have an hour. So what I always tell for folks who do a podcast, think about that hour, but don't think about the clock. Think about the top of the hour. So if you can speak to up to an hour, if you think you have enough to say with that guest for an hour, use every gosh darn second of that hour. But after 45 minutes, you feel like I've gotten everything I had to say. The guest has gotten everything they had to say. I'm good to pull the plug. So the great thing about podcasts is there is no locked in time, which is wonderful. But again, you always have to be respectful of your guest time and, of course, your time, because sometimes you may not be able to have 2 hours on a calendar to block out for a podcast. So think about it from starting from that hour, reverse engineering it, how much I can, squeeze as much as I can from that fruit in that 1 hour, and then it's good to go. Sometimes when you get over that hour, then that's when you get into the expectations of the audience. Like, man, I don't know if I can listen to a 2-hour podcast, but I could definitely listen to a 30 or 45-minute podcast. So when it comes to time, always think about that. Like, how much can you get out of that 1 hour?
So Joe, let's talk about podcasts and really where they came from and an evolution a little bit, right? So the evolution to me would be, of course, radio, right? And the limitation of radio was, number one, you had advertising and commercial messages that really dictated how long your segments could be, how long your interviews could be. So if you had a great interview and you wanted to go a bit longer, you weren't able to do that. The other limitation with radio is that radio was in a market. And let's just say we were in New York City, our broadcast radius was within X miles of New York City. And so if I had a great guest, if I had a great show, somebody in Los Angeles wasn't going to be able to listen to my show. Now, over time, of course, radio stations started broadcasting through the internet. So yes, I could download the app and I could listen to the Joe Pardavia New York City-based radio show on my app in Los Angeles. But let's just talk about this evolution for a minute from radio to podcast. So talk for a minute about kind of the evolution and then also talk about distribution, right? So if I'm going to have a podcast, like, where do I distribute it? How do people download it? How do people listen to it? There are a lot of different platforms. There's Apple iTunes, there's Spotify, there's probably a gazillion others. Should I be on all of them? Should I only be on some of them? Man, I got a lot of questions.
Yeah, there's a lot here, Adam. And I will say, in terms of the evolution from radio to podcasting, as you know, I worked in over 20 years in Radio New York. And another thing you missed, Adam, was the timing of it. Radio was on and gone. if you weren't, so I work from 6 to 10 in the morning. If people that weren't available to listen to the radio from 6 to 10 in the morning, they didn't listen to me. They didn't know who the hell I was. But people that listen during drive time, which is the number one most listened to time of day, you have the biggest impact. So in terms of where podcasting came from, many people like to credit Adam Curry, the great MTV VJ, who started podcasting before phones had internet connection. So what you would have to do was you would create a radio show, you would put it on the internet, and the person would then need to, this could be crazy for people, would need to then connect their phone to their computer to download that episode into their phone and then take their phone with them and listen to it. That's hence the podcast. It came through the Apple iTunes thing. And then obviously the internet evolved, the technology evolved, and then the podcast could be directly streamed to your phone, which is it's a remarkable jump which happened within a few years. And one of the things that I often talk about, Adam, is the fact that radio was always music driven, and you had a few, maybe 3 or 4 rock star talk show hosts, the Rush Limbaughs, the Howard Sterns, the Don Imuses of the world. But it was mostly music driven programming. And then what happened was the podcasting came around and people responded to it in a way that they didn't respond during the terrestrial radio days. What podcasting is now, Adam, and you might remember this, it's AM radio. AM radio was your local talk station that would have usually middle-aged white guys talking about the news or something that's going on in the world. And that's what podcasting has become. It's really become AM radio, uninterrupted conversations that were long form, extended now without commercials, although now you obviously have commercials and ads thrown in it, but there's really no interruption in it. So the way it evolved from terrestrial to podcasting is remarkable because the time frame is just crazy. I think the podcast in general started in like the mid 90s, but like to think about, like within 30 years, we've gone into what I explained was a really haphazard way of listening to a podcast. And now like your podcast is coming to your phone or your smart home device or your television instantly. It's crazy what's happened. But the idea of being able to use the technology and harness it in a way that you could create almost a live feel. Like you have people doing podcasts based on something that's in breaking news within the breaking news. So it's not like the old days of like, oh man, I can't wait to see what my podcast host has to say coming up, or radio host has to say on Monday morning. That podcast host is popping on Saturday if something happens and they're doing a podcast. So the immediacy and the fact that you can create content, and the audio version of it is so fast and so quick to produce. Obviously with video, it's a little more higher barrier entry, but still you're able to create content very quickly. And so it's just a remarkable medium to work in because you're able to work fast, you're able to work ahead, but you're also able to find that happy medium of being able to schedule out your content, work in a comfortable rhythm. So it is a great medium for anyone who feels like they have something to say. Sometimes not all of our authors feel comfortable on a microphone, Adam. You know that. Some people just, people love the written word. But then there are some people who just love to speak to other people, and that's where the magic of podcasting comes in.
Yeah, so let's talk about distribution. Where do people get podcasts? And again, should I be in all of those places, or is there one or two that are really the holy grail and everything else, is irrelevant?
Yeah. The great thing about distribution now, Adam, is if you use any typical podcast hosting platform, it's one touch, and then you are simultaneously delivered to every single podcast platform that exists. So obviously not all of them are weighted the same. We all know the big players, Apple, Spotify. So obviously when it comes to promoting, you want to promote that you're available on Apple and Spotify because that's where most people are listening. I would say a majority, if not more than 70% of the people who listen to podcasts are listening to via Apple or Spotify. I will mention the video aspect of it. YouTube, over the last several years, has become the number one search engine when it comes to podcasts. People are finding podcasts on YouTube. So what the great thing that's happened with Google recently was Google used to have if you're an Android user, you would used to listen to your podcast on the Google audio platform. They've done away with that. They now send all of their podcasts, audio or video podcasts, to the YouTube app. So if you have a podcast right now, your podcast, even though if it's audio only, is available on YouTube. And Adam, we've talked about it ad nauseum on this podcast, how YouTube is what, the number two search engine on the planet? Number So think about it. Your podcast is now easily found on the biggest search platform on the world. So that is, in terms of distribution, Adam, it's super key that you're on Apple and Spotify, but make sure if your app is not doing it, is make sure that your podcast, even though if it's not video, is available on YouTube, because I've looked at the numbers. There are people that are using YouTube to listen to podcasts without video. They have it in the background. Every phone has the app. It's easy to consume. It's easy to find. And if you're totally missing out, if you're not at least using your audio on YouTube.
Joe, one of the things that I've talked about and my co-author Rusty Shelton and I talk about in our book, The Authority Advantage, is this idea that about a third of your content should be what we call you-driven content. So it's talking about yourself, it's talking about your expertise, it's talking about experiences that you've had. About a third of your content should be news-driven content where you're able to connect your thought leadership to things that are happening in the world that's kind of within the news cycle. And then about a third of your content should be what we call relationship-driven, right? Where you are interacting with a guest, you're interacting with a colleague, you're interacting with someone that has authority themselves, and you and they are together riffing and creating new content, right? And certainly when I think about relationship-driven content, I don't think there's a better medium to create that than a podcast. But when you're strategizing and thinking about creating your content behind those episodes, how do you look at it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I want to say one thing about what your point was. I believe podcasting connects to your first point and the fourth point. The fact that, number one, it is you-driven content and obviously relationship content. And the way you do that is strategically by a phrase that's called boomerasking. And this is not a joke about boomers. Boomerasking was coined by a Harvard professor. And boomerasking is asking questions that you have the answers to. So when it comes to a podcast, when you have a guest on, you have to think ahead. All right, I want to speak to this guest about X, Y, and Z, but I also want to talk about ABC, and I have knowledge about this. So it's asking questions of a guest that you can add on to. It's the old improv, yes, anding. So having those questions in your hip pocket are able to deliver those first point. You're creating you content because it's you talking about your expertise, but also it's building onto the relationship because you're able to share your ideas about a certain subject with a subject matter expert who will raise your authority. So it has this chain reaction effect of being able to talk about things that you want to talk about by also having a guest in there. So it's not like you're just doing a 60-minute monologue. You're able to have a conversation, but steered in a way where you're able to talk about the things you're passionate about.
Wow, boomer asking, that is a gem that I hope every viewer and every listener has written down. That's a good one. What about the setup? What about the technology, right? So it seems like even in the last few years, creating a really high quality podcast has become easier. The equipment that you need is a lot less and much more affordable. And then there's this whole idea of, the more authentic it is, the more it's going to resonate with listeners and viewers. So not having the big professional studio in many ways makes you more authentic in the eyes of the viewer or the listener. So somebody wants to do a podcast and like, great, I'm going to do a podcast. How do I get started? What equipment, what software, what resources do I need?
All right, so the first thing you should think about, Adam, is this going to be an audio-only podcast or a video podcast? Because if it's an audio podcast, the barrier of entry is very low. And that's why the joke is there's too many podcasts out there. The podcast is a lower back tattoo of the 90s. I get it. But the people that are doing great podcasts are the ones that stand out. So when you're talking about technology need for an audio-only podcast, you can get a decent Amazon microphone for under $50. If you have a decent computer, whatever it costs, that's fine. If you have internet and if you have a quiet room, that is all you need to begin a podcast. And as simple as it sounds, it's harder because you obviously have to then put in the work of all the stuff we talked about over the last 20 minutes, but also thinking about that space that you have to record, as long as it's quiet, you don't need a studio, like you said, Adam. You could just, people during the pandemic were recording in their closets, and some people still do just because of the acoustics in a closet. When it comes to video podcasting, great point, Adam. It's gotten really affordable to make a great looking video podcast at home. But then some people may not be sort of camera ready. Maybe they don't feel comfortable looking at a camera, so they stick to audio. But if you're comfortable, all of everything I just mentioned applies. The only thing I would add is good lighting. Make sure you have a key light, or put natural light into your room. Outside of that, it's very simple. Now, when it comes to guests, people may say, well, does my guest need to have a microphone set up a studio? I'm like, more times than not, it'd be great. But listen, as long as people have those things I mentioned, quiet space, good internet, and decent sound, that's all you really need for a podcast. Adam, you mentioned it a couple times there. It's like people really feel the authenticity and realness of someone just talking into their phone or talking into their computer. So don't worry too much about all those bells and whistles. It's really about setting the stage to succeed, the points I brought up, and then being strategic about what your podcast is going to be about. But anybody who feels comfortable speaking into a microphone can do a podcast. Just make sure, going back to the many points we've talked about on this podcast series, Adam, is like, make sure you know who your audience is. And last thing I'll say about this, Adam, is I use the word audience and you use the word audience. When I tell people when they start their podcast, don't think of the word audience. Think of the community. Think of a small group of people. Think about that avatar, who that person is you're listening to. If you can, the phrase we talk about a lot in this podcast, Adam, riches and niches. If you can succeed with that community, you can expand to a greater audience. But starting with that community mindset first, that's how you begin. Know that avatar. Know who that person listening is, that one person. And if I share any word of advice to anyone when they're doing a podcast, when you open your podcast, you don't say, hi, everybody, thanks for listening. No, because not everyone's listening. One person is listening. So, hey there, thanks for tuning in a new podcast. You are only broadcasting podcasts to one person at a time. Thinking that, keeping it the intimacy that we discussed, keeping that connection, knowing your audience, those are the successful first steps you need when starting a podcast.
Joe, this is awesome. Obviously, this is the medium that we use for Build Your Authority. And for this first season, everybody has been listening or watching. And only appropriate that the very last episode of the season should be a deep dive on the medium that we're using to educate and build a relationship with our audience.
Yeah, and I love doing it, Adam. And, I often joke that when I made the jump from terrestrial podcasting, working with business entrepreneurs, I was like, what do I know about business? What do I know about all these acronyms? I was interviewing Taylor Swift and, Russell Crowe one day, and the next thing I'm talking to a CEO. What am I going to talk about? And one thing I realized, Adam, at the end of the day, it's all the same. It's people telling a story. When you're doing a podcast, you're doing a radio show, you're helping people tell their story. And that's what Building Your Authority is all about. Telling your story, explaining it. And Adam, I want to give you the final word of this podcast series, this season 1. What do you want people to take away from these 10 episodes? What, if there's anything that you want people to walk away saying, I learned X, I learned this from listening to those two idiots talk about authority for 10 hours. What do you want them to take away?
Well, big picture, authority opens doors. There's not a single person listening, watching that doesn't want to open up more doors for their business, for their life, for their family, right? The more doors that open for you, the more success that you're going to have. And the more authority you have, the more doors will open. The final point to that is authority is strategic, authority is intentional, and authority can be crafted and created, right? You've got to know your stuff. You've got to be an expert on your topic. None of that can be fake. But building authority brick by brick is possible. Authority can be manufactured, meaning you have to begin. What is my end goal? Who is my target audience? What information do I have to share with them that would be valuable? And then what are the different mediums that would be most effective to reach them? Is it a book? Is it a podcast? Is it social media? Maybe it's all of the above. And then building out a content calendar and determining what content you're going to share when. So it's all strategic, it's all intentional, and it can all be done by design. What I want people to remember is authority opens doors, first and foremost. Secondly, authority can be intentionally crafted and created. And knowing those two things will give you tremendous power and can give you tremendous success in business, in life, with relationships, both personally and professionally.
It's been a great ride, Adam. Thank you very much for coming along with me, and look forward to more conversations about building authority.
Yeah, we're not done. Season 2 is going to be a big one, so stay tuned.